How's that sound? Is that okay? Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Abbey. Thank you for coming. I'm Dylan Hayden, a member of the Abbey community. I'll just give a brief introduction and a little context for tonight's lecture. Every year we invite a speaker to address a topic which would have been of relevance to our founders, and in memory of them, Stephen Burney and Fred Bloom, who started this community. Tonight's lecture by Sushila Dhall of Refugee Resource is of particular significance both to the foundation of our community and, as it happens, to the recent history of this building. Fred Bloom was, of course, a refugee from Nazi Germany. As a Jew, he was increasingly persecuted in his scholarly career through the 1930s, but was fortunately able to travel to the United States, to the University of Berkeley, and escape from the horrors of the Third Reich. And some 40 years later, came here and founded our community, where meanwhile, as it happens, the building was being used as a refuge for many other people. It was owned through the 60s and 70s by David Astor, and was first the home of the Ockenden Venture, which was a charity that gave educational and cultural exchange opportunities to displaced children in the aftermath of the Second World War. And then it was briefly the home also of Colin Winter, the exiled Bishop of Namibia, who was expelled by the South African government for his opposition to apartheid. So there's a very rich history of refuge here for our community and for this ancient building, and something that I think we still continue to hold, along with our memories of the founders, is the sense of the Abbey as in some sense a shelter for all sorts of people needing it. And so without further ado, I will hand over to Sushila for tonight's Founders Memorial Lecture. Thank you.
Let's see if I can cope with the microphone with the same aplomb. Does that sound right? Can you hear me? Yeah, good. So my name is Sushila Dhall, and I've been working for Refugee Resource for 13 years, and I started off working there as a psychotherapist, but as the years have gone by, I've taken on more responsibility, and I now manage a team of psychotherapists. There are 7 of us, and we work together and one-to-one to provide counselling and psychotherapy to refugees, asylum seekers, and vulnerable migrants who for some reason cannot move forward. And I'll say more about what happens to people and why it is they can't move forward in the course of the lecture. Refugee Resource also has a mentoring service where people from the local community befriend somebody and is matched with somebody for a year to help people gain confidence and find a way around in English. And this arose because people were getting referred to the counselling and psychotherapy service, and when we assessed them, what they were really suffering from was loneliness and lack of confidence and not knowing how to get out there and be integrated into British society, because although it's an aspiration that people who come here should be integrated, there is actually very little that people know how to access when they come here. So it's a sort of hand to hold. We also have a women's group where women of all cultures and backgrounds come together and have various classes, cook together, socialise together, bring their children together, go on a trip to the seaside once a year, and from that group many people find the confidence to join British society, get jobs, study, move forward. We, in the next room that you'll go into when this is finished, the women's group wrote a cookery book which is for sale, so I brought along a handful of them. We have an advice and advocacy service and a social inclusion service where 2 members of staff, one from the Citizens Advice Bureau and one with a background in mentoring and advice, help people with things like debt and first line immigration, although we can't do complex things, housing issues and issues where they've come into conflict with somebody. We have a men's service. The aspiration was to have a men's group, but the men didn't come together in a group the way the women did. So we have what's called a men's service. We have a football group and we have a service for men, and we operate it flexibly. And we have a small women's knitting group for women who don't feel safe enough to be in the large group, and that is run by a therapist, and women come together to knit because we discovered that if you have a small group of people all from different cultures, it's very hard to get them to communicate unless there is some activity which brings people together. We also have a very small hardship fund, which we keep quite quiet because it's so small, but we use it to make sure that anyone who really needs food or shoes or a coat or essential medicines or essential fares to appointments can just have them in a dignified way without having to fill in forms or prove anything. And we also have a small bursary fund which we use to help people access study and books or fares or whatever will enable them to take part in courses they get accepted on. However, the context I work in now is where we're seeing increasing levels of destitution and poverty and homelessness. I was in email contact with Fred Bloom's wife. He is dead, but his wife is still alive, and she wanted to come here but couldn't. And so I asked her if there was anything she would like me to say about Fred, and she said, "He was a man of great depth, who throughout his lifetime was transforming his Holocaust suffering and that of his family and other people into richly creative explorations of both the inner life of human beings and its relation to the communal and social world of work and society. He was convinced that men and women of all faiths and none must together be witness to ways of establishing a new era of truth and justice. So for me, it's a great honour to be invited to speak in a place that comes from that basis." I wanted to start off by saying that although nowadays people who move are called migrants, immigrants, asylum seekers, human beings have a history of moving. And if you look back over the generations, it's likely that at some point all of us come from families who have moved from somewhere. And so it's in this age that it's being seen as something outside the norm, but it's actually the norm for people to be on the move and for people to try and better their lives or to escape a place where life is no longer viable and move to another place. So in some ways we are encouraged to see the world in quite a divisive way. There are we who are settled and they who are on the move, but actually we are all very similar and we could all be on the move, and all of us come from people who have been on the move. I'm not going to give loads of statistics because I think they're quite boring and they tend to send people to sleep, but people tend to think that there are more refugees in this country than there are. So I thought I would just give a few figures for those people who are interested. So these are figures from the Refugee Council website, and they relate to 2016. So an estimated 65 million people throughout the world have been forced to flee their homes as the number of protracted conflicts have increased. And this has created more than 22 million refugees worldwide. However, the so-called developing countries host more than 80% of these. In the UK, and these are all estimates, there's an estimated 118,995 refugees living in the UK, and that represents 0.18 of the total population. So when people talk about hordes and swarms, the figures are actually very small. In 2016, the UK received 38,500 asylum applications, and 45% of these were granted asylum and allowed to stay once their cases had been fully concluded. Most, or many, are initially refused because it's difficult to provide the evidence needed to meet the strict criteria of what is a refugee. So I thought I would say something about the difference between a refugee, an asylum seeker and a vulnerable migrant, because the terms get used interchangeably and people don't always know what they are. An asylum seeker in this country has applied to be recognised as a refugee. They have no right to work and no right to claim benefits, and they can present as destitute. They can apply to National Asylum Support Service for a room because the government has bought hostels and flats and shared houses in very deprived areas where you can buy large amounts of housing very cheaply, and they are run by the local authority who usually contract the work out to agencies. Asylum seekers in this country have no choice about where they live and don't know where they're going to live. They can apply for £36 a week to live on, and because of the way that they live, they suffer from isolation, racism, and traumatic memories and depression. And this is exacerbated by the fact that they are not allowed to do paid or voluntary work. Refugees are people who have been accepted by the Home Office as having a justifiable fear of being sent back to their country of origin. Nowadays, instead of being given indefinite leave to remain, they're given 5 years to remain, and towards the end of that 5 years, they can apply for indefinite leave to remain, although what we're seeing is they're often given another short period, which makes it very difficult for people to feel secure and think in terms of having a long-term future to build for. Migrants come to this country on a visa to study or work, and they only become asylum seekers or vulnerable if their country breaks down in their absence, as we saw at the beginning of the war with Syria. The first people we saw at Refugee Resource were not refugees or asylum seekers from Syria, but people who were studying at Oxford University who suddenly couldn't go home and who were desperately worried about their families and friends. We also see what we call vulnerable migrants who have been brought to the UK for marriage purposes or have been trafficked into the UK, and domestic and sexual slavery are still surprisingly common but hidden in this country. People who have been trafficked to the UK can have major challenges trying to make an autonomous life, even if they were trafficked as young children. And in fact, when you get people who were trafficked as young children, they sometimes don't know what their country of origin was, and so they end up stateless. And when someone is stateless, there's nowhere to deport them to, and they have no right to be here. So they have no national insurance number, and that makes access to any kind of support, work, bank accounts, driving licence extremely difficult and often impossible. So why do people flee? People often have no time or space to think about making a choice to flee their country. When society breaks down, or civil war breaks out, or a minority is targeted, law and order can unravel extremely fast, or events can creep up on people. Safety can quickly be lost, almost overnight. Typically, ordinary people who live safe lives, like most of ourselves, I hope, first hope that brewing trouble will blow over. And then, when they see it won't blow over, they hope that it will somehow bypass them and those that they love. So the same was seen in Nazi Germany, when until Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass in November 1938, many Germans, Jews and non-Jews, believed that society had reached such a state of civilization that the mob could no longer rise and law and order would always protect them. For the same reason, even beyond 1938, many German people found it very hard to believe that there could be such a thing as death camps in a civilized country where law and order had seemed to prevail. So this meant that a great many people who could have fled perished or were killed, and many fled at the last minute in great danger, losing everything, including family members, on the way. There was no longer any choice. It was a question of to survive or not. When events of an overwhelming and uncontrollable nature take place, such as a major attack on one's self or one's loved ones or one's home or one's community, as can happen in the context of war and the targeting of minorities, human beings can flip into a state of heightened panic where our life force itself asserts itself, and the survival of the self and our loved ones becomes the uppermost drive. At that point, calm thinking and planning is suspended, along with normal mental processing. Physiological changes take place in the body, so that a person is primed for fight, flight, or freeze, which means scarcely breathing and behaving as if one is already dead, which is sometimes the only thing a person can do. If they can't fight and they can't flee, they will freeze. The pupils dilate to let in more light. Breathing becomes fast and shallow as lungs maximize their capacity to take in oxygen. The digestion seizes up. Blood leaves the vital organs and the face and rushes to the arms and legs, which may start to tremble. Saliva production is suspended and the mouth becomes dry, and the system is flooded with adrenaline. Normal thinking is replaced by a hyper-vigilant watchfulness, and nothing peripheral is taken in unless it relates to the danger. And this is why some asylum claims fail when questions are asked about what exactly was going on the periphery at the time of fleeing. I've threaded a case example through this, and I haven't used a single person. I've sort of put together a composite case study to protect people's identities, but I thought it might be helpful to have the story of somebody who came to Refugee Resource. And so I start with part of it, and then throughout the lecture, I'll say what happened next. So I've called him Y, and he was a teacher and family man whose knowledge of himself had been destroyed when a class he taught on history had been reported to authorities as subversive. And this can happen very easily. It can happen sometimes when somebody makes a joke about the government or criticises people who are around the government. So armed men burst into his classroom and forced him to undress in front of his pupils and marched him through the streets naked, turned his house upside down, and discovered what they called subversive literature, which is often pamphlets from a minor political party. They punished him by raping his wife and daughters, throwing his baby son into the well, and kidnapping his older sons. So shortly after the armed men left, his wife killed herself, and his sister took his daughters into her family's care in a neighbouring town. So at that point, Y fled. He didn't know and he didn't care where he was going. He couldn't bear his memories, and he found that all he could do was run. He climbed into a lorry at an unknown border and arrived in the UK not having known where the lorry was bound. A person in Y's situation is running to try to get away not only from acute danger, but from things that human beings are not equipped to be able to bear, and operating from the same instinct that makes your eye blink shut when something comes towards it. But operating in this state can make a person feel very unwell. And the journeys themselves are also stressful and even traumatic. And many people don't survive them. Someone who is fleeing will often start on foot, although packed vehicles, journeys by rail and air, and even camels are sometimes used, especially across deserts. It's not unusual for people fleeing war or societal unrest to take long treks lasting days, weeks, and even months over mountain ranges and deserts. And one of the things we learn at Refugee Resource is the incredible resilience of human beings, because the people that we see have survived things that you wouldn't imagine people could survive, but they do. So that's where the hope lies. People are incredibly resilient and adaptable. If people feel somebody's following them, they may try to rest by day and flee by night. Once people reach a border, if they can, they will cross. And immediately they're in a country where they may have no rights and they may be exploited or abused. However, 80% of the world's refugees find a safe place to stop, or a safe enough place to stop, in a country adjacent to their own. And that means that the majority of refugees are in African and Middle Eastern or Asian countries. But those who cannot find a place to safely stop simply keep moving. People flee in terror and they don't make preparations. And some families under threat just send an oldest son, hoping he will survive. So in Afghanistan, where the Taliban tries to recruit boys when they come a certain age or when they look a certain age, and boys will often refuse. Many boys are very gentle, they don't want to fight. So if they refuse, they or their families are attacked and killed. So the family will rapidly get together what they can for the oldest son and send him off into the world to try to make somebody safe. There are many thousands of children trying to reach places of safety in the world. And we hear stories of people with few resources who work for weeks on borders to get a place on a little boat, one of those boats you see on the TV. I only heard about them. They only started filming them in recent years. But people pay a lot of money for a place in one of those boats. And then they come to a border in Europe, maybe in Italy or Greece. And that's where people find that you are not always welcome in the EU. The border guards try to keep people out. So people will try to get under a lorry, into a lorry, under a seat on a train, under a train, which is, of course, very highly dangerous. And because they're getting into a train or a lorry, they often don't know where they're going or where they're going to end up. So we often see people who didn't know that they were in the UK when they first arrived here. They just were tipped out of the lorry, for example, on the A34. However, many people get stuck in border camps for long periods in Greece or Calais or Jordan, for example, and endure conditions of squalor and deprivation and live without protection. Some people disappear en route and some people disappear in the UK and nobody ever knows what becomes of them. But traffickers who will say to people, well, if you can work for this amount of money, I can give you safe journey to a safe place, will sometimes bring people to the UK, and the people will claim asylum and get asylum, and then they are kidnapped and taken into some kind of slavery. However, nothing prepares people, or someone who is fleeing, for the fact that cultures are different everywhere. So when people come, they bring their own culture with them. Nobody tells them that cultures are different in other parts of the world. Many people don't go to school. When people get to the UK, there's a legal obligation to claim asylum within 48 hours of arriving. Not everyone knows that. Sometimes we've seen people who have been here for years and they've been living under the radar, working, for example, on building sites or in kebab vans, and they haven't claimed asylum, although they could have, and nobody has told them that they could claim asylum. So when people come, for example, if they get dropped on the A34, they will walk until they come to a town or city, and this is why I say the A34, because we see those who have walked into Oxford, hoping to find food, shelter, work, hoping to enable dependents, if they are still alive, to come and join them so they can support them or enable them to support themselves. But what people don't know is what you say and what you don't say. So what is relevant? So for example, if a woman comes from a country where rape is used as a weapon of war and commonplace, they may not realise that it's something that you say when you go for your Home Office interview. They would just assume it was normal. Or they might not feel safe enough to mention it if the Home Office interviewer looks hostile or tired, or the interpreter is unknown or from an opposing faction or tribe. And interpretation isn't easy. In some countries, if you say that you were raped, there isn't a translation for that because it's not considered polite. So we've seen people who have said in their interview, "and I was raped," but it's been translated as, "she went with several men." And so it seems as though the person did something that they wanted to do, and it's only later it comes out at Refugee Resource with a therapist or a mentor that this was not the story that they have given is not the true story. However, if something isn't stated in the initial asylum claim, it is extremely hard to get it taken into account later, because if you go back and say, "Oh, I didn't say this, I meant to say that," they will say, "Well, you've been told to say that, you're just saying that because you know you're not going to get asylum and you've been told that this will get you asylum." So it's very, very hard, if you don't say your story correctly right away, to actually say it later. But people do. People do make appeals, and excellent solicitors mean that people do win on appeal. The UK is still a good country. It's a safe country where law and order prevails, but it's not as good as its reputation. People have a right to claim asylum here. They have legal access to interpreters. They can apply for shelter. And some people live for many years in national asylum support housing, as asylum claims can take many years to be concluded. And this results in enforced poverty and dependence. And the enforced dependence is one of the things that's very difficult, because if you get asylum after being in enforced dependence for 8 years, and then you have to learn the system of how to find work or study, it's then extra difficult. But the way in which the law is interpreted and carried out in this country can leave a lot to be desired, because it's only as good as the people who are carrying it out. And immigrant has become a dirty word in the UK. A hostile media and governments can be only too glad to turn the heat onto foreigners when people start getting angry. And asylum seekers are frequently so ashamed of their lack of status that they hide it, and they hide their powerlessness and their poverty and their homelessness and carry themselves with great dignity. It's a shock to people to find that when they come to the UK, they are accorded a lesser humanity. Asylum seekers are not only not allowed to work or claim benefits, they're not allowed to rent a room, go to college or university. If they're children, they get age assessed, and a weary, exhausted teenager who, if they have an Adam's apple or traces of facial hair in boys or developed breasts in girls, can be told that they're 19, too old for education, care or protection. The onus is on the asylum seeker to prove that they are telling the truth, and if they can't prove they're telling the truth, they're assumed to be lying. There are countries which we have good trading links with, which are considered safe. They're on what's called a whitelist, and so people will get sent back to them, although they're actually not safe. And then trauma and complex grief make it very hard to recount what happened in unsympathetic courtrooms. So many claims fail the first time around on details such as people not knowing what day it was when they fled into the jungle after a massacre, or not being able to prove that their injuries are the result of torture and not of what's been called heavy sports activities, or calling somebody uncle and then referring to them as cousin when they've come from a place where everyone in the village is known as cousin or uncle or father, and the words are used pretty interchangeably. Or not knowing what the day was in the Western calendar when events took place. And when somebody gives a wrong answer or things are assumed to not add up, that is evidence on the part of the law that the claim lacks credibility. And once an asylum seeker has it on their record that their claim lacks credibility, it's a very hard accusation to challenge, because then it can be said that no matter what they say, well, they've already lied, so they're going to be lying. So people do get deported who should have been offered asylum. But many people are refused asylum and they don't leave the country. So we see a significant number of people who have reached the end of the road with claims, and they have no right to anything in this country, but they don't feel safe enough to go back to their own country. And this is a problem which is rising and very stressful for those of us who work in the sector. Many people do win on appeal, but this takes finding a dedicated solicitor, and nowadays in order to get legal aid, it has to be proven that your claim has a more than 50% chance of success on appeal. So that's becoming increasingly hard. When Theresa May was Home Secretary, she created the concept of a culture of hostility towards immigrants, and it was intended to ensure that immigrants would feel so unwelcome that they would choose to leave the UK on their own accord. But this hostility means that appeals are delayed, papers are lost, decisions are not communicated, and asylum seekers can be arbitrarily detained and then released, and left in a state of Kafkaesque poverty and disempowerment. People who have been forced into the role of victims in their own country want to regain their sense of personal agency, but being forced to remain in an impoverished, dependent state can drive some to despair. Many of the people that we see were teachers, doctors, nurses, lawyers, engineers, etc., members of the government in their own countries, but their qualifications are not recognised in the UK. Not surprisingly, suicide rates are higher for asylum seekers than for the general population, linked to loss of sense of self, loss of faith in humanity, difficulty bearing memories, multiple complex loss of hope for the future, and extreme hardship that can seem unending. And one of the things at Refugee Resource we do is we say to people, it will not always be like this. And we can say that with some certainty, because once people get into our service, we will stand by them and try to make sure that they can access what is on offer, which people don't always know about. So, moving on with the case study, Y's asylum claim failed because it was ruled that he could live in another part of his country under an assumed name. When he came to Refugee Resource, an appeal was pending, and it had been pending for 3 years, on the grounds that he was seriously mentally ill. He was homeless, yet carried himself with dignity. But he barely slept, had made no friends, and couldn't trust anyone. and when he suffered flashbacks which were triggered easily, he would collapse and shake on the floor. So he was on high levels of antipsychotic drugs. Not all asylum seekers and refugees find they cannot carry their pasts and find they can't move forward. A great many come to this country, get asylum, and pick up their lives and become contributing, functioning members of our society. But Refugee Resource is a mental health charity, and so we see those whose experiences have proved too much for them and who cannot move forward, and our job is to help them to regain some hope and to move forward. So in the counselling service, we have to work with great care, because when we first see people, they feel as though they have no meaning, they have no coherence, they've lost everything they knew, including their sense of self. And it's quite interesting when you think about the little cues every day that remind you who you are: your alarm clock, getting out of bed, getting into the shower, making a cup of coffee, locking the door as you leave. All these little things remind us who we are. And if one of those things doesn't work properly, it's a little bit disturbing. Not hugely disturbing, but it's annoying. When you lose absolutely everything, all those little gentle cues, it can be very dehumanizing for people, because they are not getting a sense of who they are back from what is around them. So they'll get a sense of themselves as poor, worthless, not having a role which is valued. And they're made into victims, but they will not have the mentality of those who are victims, because they're not really victims, they've been put into the role of a victim. And I'm sorry if I'm not being very clear. You can ask questions if it sounds unclear. But presenting symptoms in someone who is in this situation include loss of trust in and fear of other people, isolation and terror and loss of trust in life, sleeplessness, intrusive bad memories and nightmares, physical illness and bodily pains. And the physical illness and bodily pains are because when someone is in a state of acute tension and suffering flashbacks which remind them of things which are unbearable, they get digestive problems, sore necks, headaches, sometimes stomach ulcers, sometimes bowel problems, sometimes joint problems, but a lot of people come with the same symptoms. The client can appear shocked and frozen, and they don't have any capacity to imagine things except for remembering things over and over again. Some clients can come to us hallucinating and hearing voices, which used to be thought of as symptoms of some kind of psychotic illness, but it's now known that if people suffer extreme depression or trauma, they can suffer these same symptoms. Helen Bamber was one of the UK's best-known therapists working with victims of torture. She died not long ago, in August 2014. And she said that the worst toll of torture was psychic, the act of killing without dying, designed to destroy not only the physical and psychological integrity of one individual, but with every blow, his or her family and the next generation. The body betrays and is hated for its injuries, a body which is a constant reminder, even if there are no scars or remaining injuries. But Helen Bamber found that if she could help a person reconnect to the self that they had known before the atrocity took place, or reconnect with the smallest of good memories, this helped a person to tell their story from a place of some integrity. And this sounds well and good, and indeed for some this is what works. But there are times when remembering what is good becomes unbearable, because it is attached to a memory of how it was destroyed. And this is often the state people are in when they come to Refugee Resource. So we at Refugee Resource, in the therapy service, we start very gently. We start by staying in the present. We won't go back to anything. We start by helping a person to feel safe in the therapy room with the therapist, and we don't ask any more than this. So we may start by talking about nothing but what happened on the way here. What was your walk here like? What do you do at night when you can't sleep? Where do you live, if you live somewhere? And at the same time, we can then very gently find out if a person is being exploited and if they are getting everything they have a right to get in the way of support. But it's very, very gentle. It's important to say at this point, though, that asylum seekers in this country have fewer and fewer rights, and that makes finding appropriate shelter or support increasingly challenging. However, I'll say more about that later, because in fact it's ordinary people in the UK who have come forward and helped with that situation. So once a client feels as safe and grounded as possible in the present, at that point we may very gently, and this is very different with each person, we may start to ask people about what their lives were like before the catastrophe. So early childhood, any good memories, what were your parents like? Most people who come to this country have had very good lives, full of meaning, went to school, part of a society, were loved and loved, enjoyed certain foods and so on. So we do this very gently as part of a conversation. When someone is traumatised and bereaved and they haven't been able to bear to think about times when things were okay and they were loved, if you can help them to remember a time when they were loved, they will make contact inside themselves with an image of the person who they loved or who loved them. And there are ways of isolating good memories and strengthening them so that they become a resource. And then people can know that because they were loved and because they loved, they could still be lovable and they can still love. And that is very important. So then you have the present, which feels safe, and you have the distant past, which is then somehow still intact. And it's only once a person is securely grounded in the two of those is it safe to start to talk about traumatic events. And even then, we do so extremely slowly. We start with the least traumatic of events. And some people don't want to talk about it, and we don't make them do it. Sometimes it's good enough just to be grounded in the present and to have good memories. However, it's very important not to rush this work. In this age of 6 sessions with a counsellor or 10 sessions of CBT to help a person manage their symptoms, what we do at Refugee Resource is rare, and it represents a considerable investment in a person. However, once a person who has been secure and loved and lived a meaningful life gets the hang of the counselling work, they often tend to move on and heal very quickly because they have been all right. And the war or the catastrophe will often represent actually a very short period in what has altogether been a good life. However, we often don't get to finish our counselling work because as our clients feel health return, they rush off to voluntary work, or if they have refugee status, they will often work at 2 or 3 jobs at the same time and study at night. Our work is also compromised by people being homeless, hungry, suddenly deported, or suddenly moved around. So what we try to do is endeavour to treat everyone as human and intrinsically equal and ensure a warm welcome, even if that's all we can do. And we try to restore people's sense of themselves as worthwhile to themselves. So the first thing we did with Y was to help him feel safe in the counselling room. And that turned out to be the place where he started to relax for the first time in 4 years. Once he was able to take in the words of the counsellor was able to offer some techniques for staying in the present, such as feeling one's feet on the floor, a bit of mental health first aid. If someone can feel their feet on the floor, they are present in the room with you. Slowly, the counsellor began to ask why, to talk about the past before the atrocities took place, and found that he'd had a very stable foundation inside him. He had loved and been loved, which is always a really good thing. He was an intelligent and well-educated man. His anger at himself and the reason he had frozen so much was not only the trauma, but his lack of capacity to protect his pupils and to protect his family. And now he started to properly grieve. It took several months for him to tell his story in full for the first time, and the sessions were extremely hard. But gradually, Y began to reduce his use of medication and started to feel a bit less exhausted. There are aspects of UK society that we take for granted as normal, to the extent that we don't even see them, which are immediately noticeable to someone coming from a very different culture. They include a lack of fear on the part of people in speaking up, even to criticise authorities. Some people are terrified when they hear us criticising the government. We try not to do that at work, but they hear it all around them. They see women wearing what they think of as revealing clothing. They see equality between genders, empowered young people, law and order that can usually be trusted, free education and healthcare paid for by taxes in a system that is pretty much wholly free of corruption. This creates what we call culture shock, where a person has no idea whatsoever how to fit in, how to behave, how to express what they think of this strange new country, and even whether it's safe to do so, and how to begin to integrate. Integration is a word which is flung around a lot. People must integrate. But people don't necessarily think about what that means when you come from a culture which is completely different from ours and have to begin to learn from scratch what the cues are, what jokes are, and figures of speech. So loss of life as one has known it, added to loss of unconsciously expected cultural cues, add up to a loss of sense of self, which is a very disorientating feeling. Often, in times of inequality and obvious injustice, it's ordinary people, such as caring GPs and dentists, we've found, overworked pro bono solicitors, frontline welfare advisors, housing officers, people who work well beyond the call of duty, charities such as the Red Cross, Host Oxford, Host Abingdon, Asylum Welcome, and also Refugee Resource, who support asylum seekers and refugees with what they need. The needs of asylum seekers, vulnerable migrants and refugees can be broadly defined under three headings. Legal issues, which are probably the first one to put in place. Basic needs such as shelter, subsistence and meaningful pursuit. And then help to manage the scale of the losses, fear and trauma of what has happened in their lives. Since the highlighting 2 years ago, this month in fact, of the body of asylum seeker toddler Aylan Kurdi, the 3-year-old boy photographed dead on a lonely beach, ordinary people in the UK have been wonderfully supportive, opening their homes to asylum-seeking people and grouping together to see how they can help, doing things like going to Calais and highlighting the issues. Host Oxford and Host Abingdon and like groups have ensured that far fewer asylum seekers are homeless and destitute. However, support is also needed for those people supporting asylum seekers in this way. It's not that simple to offer a room or friendship. Cultural misunderstanding takes place very easily. This is because we are all what we have been formed by. All people and cultures and families tend to deeply believe, without knowing it, that ours is the right way, whatever that way is. And whether we know it or not, this is the viewpoint all of us in the whole world, all human beings, start from, no matter what background we're from. So clashes or negative judgment can take place when perceived differences are given social significance. Colour of hair, for example, is given no social significance, on the whole. Colour of skin is given social significance. Pitch of voice does not, on the whole, have social significance, but accent, in terms of class judgments, does have social significance. Some of our norms, which we take for granted and which can seem strange to people coming to this country, are eating with cutlery, usually metal, saying please, thank you, sorry, excuse me, to the extent that we will even, and I've done this myself, apologise to somebody who has just bumped into us or stood on our foot. Oh, sorry. Seems utterly strange to people from other countries. Queuing, so waiting for a bus, you get behind one another, and if someone bypasses the queue and gets straight onto the bus, people don't say, hey, you, there's a queue, but they look at each other and mutter. That's not understood by people necessarily. Paying taxes isn't necessarily understood. If someone thinks if they've got a job, someone's paying them, they don't know that they've got to pay taxes, and that's one of the ways in which we've seen people get into trouble. We tend to know our rights and responsibilities. We tend to know how to read and write and fill in forms, so if somebody hands us a form to fill in, we don't completely freak out. We know we've got to fill it in. It's tedious, but it's not terrifying on the whole. We tend to know how to use a computer. We look at people when we talk to them. This can be quite frightening in a culture where you don't. We tend to fill up silence. We're not that comfortable with silence in this country, so if there's a silence, somebody will usually say something, no matter how relevant. And we tend to be on time. So if somebody says 2 o'clock, we'll be there at 2 o'clock. We won't be there 4 o'clock or the Wednesday after. We view everyone through our cultural lens, which I call our habitual position. And norms in our culture can also change. So, for example, homosexuality used to be a crime. Now it's legal and for the most part accepted. Some norms from other cultures include male dominance, expecting needs to be met and expecting a welcome, smacking naughty children, again something which was a norm until recently in this country, eating with hands or bread or sticks of some kind, openly staring or not looking at each other's faces, ability to bear silence, inability to begin a conversation without asking after every single family member, whether you have them or not, covering up one's arms, legs or head, carrying infants on the body for many years sometimes and breastfeeding on demand, co-sleeping, which is frowned on in this country, although I happen to know it's done quite a lot, and different ways of seeing time. So one of the things we found at Refugee Resource was it's no good just to say to people, come at 2 o'clock on Wednesday, because from other cultures, people will interpret that variously as sometime after 2 p.m. on Wednesday, or sometime later in the week, but not before 2 p.m. on Wednesday, or 3:30 p.m. So we have to say to people, and if you do not come at 2 o'clock, and that means 5 to 2, you will not get your appointment and you will have to come back again. So we have to actually say it in a kind way, but it's a big shock to people to think they could be penalised for not coming on time. And we get a lot of people living in dire poverty and destitution, pretending everything is okay and telling everyone is fine. And that's because they don't trust anyone. So it can be useful working with someone who is a refugee or an asylum seeker or a vulnerable migrant to find out if anyone else is supporting them and getting permission to liaise with that person or people. Otherwise, you sometimes haven't got a clue what's happening for someone. You can tell something is, but you have no idea. So it's very important not to judge people as wrong when they make a cultural blunder because they're not from the same culture as ourselves. There are hidden norms that can lead to attitudes that we might not be aware of, and it's useful to know that they might be there in ourselves and in others. And some hidden beliefs are that black or white people can't be trusted, that men or women can't be trusted. Some people think they must never say no, and so we get people who don't really want a service from Refugee Resource, but they've been sent there, and they can't say no, so they say yes and just don't turn up. Some people think they need to appear grateful at all times. Some people think that if you care, it means you want to be part of their family. Some people are afraid of saying anything bad about their country because it seems like a betrayal of their culture. And some people believe that if they talk about bad things, they will make them happen. Some people believe that no matter how little they have, they must give a gift if they're given something. And some people believe that if a woman doesn't cover her body, it means she's available or unwell, or there must be something wrong with her, she's vulnerable. So it's very important not to assume that people know what the expected norms for the UK are. Cross-cultural communication means being constantly willing to learn, sometimes constantly humbled, to set aside one's initial reaction and to stop before assuming anything. So, for example, in some cultures it's very rude to say thank you. It's an insult. It implies that the giver didn't give wholeheartedly. But that lack of a thank you can be misinterpreted by someone from the UK as rudeness or lack of care or ingratitude. There's often an unconscious expectation that asylum seekers and refugees should be grateful for what's done for them, whether they have wanted it or not. So, for example, a volunteer secures a job at a checkout in a supermarket for a refugee client who happens to be a shy scientist who loves the outdoors and is very depressed. So the person may receive this job at a checkout with very mixed feelings, which may not be understood by the helper. After all, it's a job. So at Refugee Resource, we help to educate people from other cultures in the norms of the UK. And this can be a huge shock. It can mean a loss of role and status within families for men and boys, and a gain in freedom and empowerment for women and girls. However, in that process, marriages can break down, and men can get into trouble with the law for assuming they have rights that they don't have in the UK. For example, to insist on seeing a wife who doesn't wish to see them, which is called stalking, or to make her come back home. And people also need to understand that it's not legal in the UK to hit children, and that is a shock to parents who look around and then say to us, yes, but your young people are so rude and spoiled. It's quite difficult. So misunderstandings can arise when a refugee client isn't sure exactly what's on offer. If someone says to someone from another country, you must come to dinner sometime, they're waiting for that invitation for the coming week. If someone offers something like money or a home, it can be very difficult for a person to know where that offer ends. So it's ever so important to say, I'm giving a room, but I'm not giving you meals, and I'm not giving anything else. And it has to be done very gently to enable people to keep their dignity, but it is important to do it. It's important to bear in mind that many people will pretend they can read and write if they think that's expected of them. But we see people who can't read and write in any language, including English, which means that when they're told, oh, just go online and fill a form in, they say, yes, 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 and then they come to us and they haven't got a clue what it is they've been told to do. We find it helps to let people know that in Oxford many local people are homeless or sofa surfing or living in substandard or insecure accommodation, because it makes it less personal. It makes people not feel, oh, it's because I'm from another country, I'm just being treated differently. Many people come from cultures where you don't say no, where you never say no. And many people come from highly hospitable cultures where the guest is given the best of everything. So we've seen instances of clients being visited by, for example, a housing officer, and the clients will spend their whole week's small budget on snacks and tea for the visit from the housing officer, who actually doesn't want snacks and tea, they just want to come and fill in a form. At Refugee Resource, we use interpreters where we need to, when our clients can't express themselves in English, partly so that we can express ourselves and we can understand them, and to minimise the kind of misunderstanding that can take place. We're very lucky. We have a group of interpreters who we've trained, who work in a variety of languages. We have to be very careful about selecting interpreters because they shouldn't offer their own advice or opinions during the work. And the work can be emotionally fraught and may also trigger bad memories in the interpreters, many of whom have a refugee background themselves. We have to very carefully match the interpreter to the client because we have to ensure there's no religious or tribal or factional conflict. So sometimes clients need to work with an interpreter who is not from their own country. So, for example, we've had a Syrian Arabic speaker matched with an Egyptian interpreter because this person didn't feel they could criticise the Syrian government in front of another Syrian person. Many of our clients speak at least 5 languages, so if someone doesn't want an interpreter in their language, they will use one of their other languages and we'll get an interpreter in that language. So we're all speaking through the medium of a language which is nobody's first language. We learn bits of many languages over the years, and sometimes I've learned so much of a language that I can tell what the client has said before the interpreter interprets it. And it's quite interesting to see the slant that is put on it, because everyone puts a slant on what's interpreted. You can't interpret from one language to another, because every language represents a whole philosophical system and way of thought and way of understanding the world. So the poor interpreter is working really hard and everything goes through them. We run a regular interpreters support group in recognition of the fact that interpreters have no voice whatsoever of their own in sessions, and they receive the first impact of whatever is said, and they have to keep confidentiality, so it can be quite lonely, potentially traumatising work. However, many things are said in sessions which haven't been stated in asylum claims, and for this reason we often get asked by solicitors to write letters which the solicitor will use in support of somebody's appeal or asylum claim. So the conclusion to Y's story: the counsellor wrote a letter to Y's solicitor telling his whole story with Y's support, and Y was finally granted limited leave to remain in the UK for 5 years. He then wanted to try to find his daughters, and so Refugee Resource supported him to contact the Red Cross tracing service. The Red Cross have offices all over the world, and they do a job where they will, if someone is missing or disappeared, they take all the details of the last place the person was seen and everything about them, and they will trace them. And so we've seen some very moving reunions through the work of the Red Cross, who are such an amazing organisation. I think that when I retired I might go and work for them. After 7 months, Y's daughters were found, but his sister-in-law, knowing that Y was in the UK, and assuming, as many people do, that anyone who has made it to the UK is now very wealthy, said she couldn't continue to look after them unless Y sent some money regularly. So Y took a job as a cleaner and sent most of the money he earned to care for his daughters. And Y went to the food bank and asylum welcome and open door and other places where food is available free of charge, and that's how he ate. Being in touch with his daughters gave him a real reason to live. He started to do GCSEs at Oxford and Cherwell Valley College and aims to retrain as a teacher in the UK. He remains very vulnerable, but he's much better. He has 2 friends now whom he trusts. He has a room in a shared house, and he's no longer a suicide risk. Most of the time, he feels he has a future. And that is a very typical case study from Refugee Resource. The UK has an undeserved reputation for being able to give everyone what they need, and people come to this country truly believing the streets are paved with gold. And this is partly because when people come here, if they're suffering and impoverished, they don't want anyone who may be alive, those who have families still alive, they don't want them to know that they're suffering. So they'll say, yes, I'm fine, yes, I've got plenty of money, and the next thing that happens is the family's ready to send someone else, or they want money from the person. So thus, the myth that the UK is a very wealthy country is perpetuated. It may be wealthy, but not everyone has a good life here. So people who make it to this country come wholly believing that they will be able to find work and a home and be safe from fear and anxiety. And it's a huge shock to find that housing is in short supply, expensive, and can be substandard or overcrowded. And it's a huge shock to find that asylum seekers have no right to work or access to public funds. When we can't meet people's needs at Refugee Resource, we have an ethos of treating everyone with respect and warmth. And we will just openly admit that we too wish the situation was different. We will admit that it's hard not to be able to help. We acknowledge that we know that this is not what they had hoped for, and we wish them well, even if they and we don't know what they're going to do. When good people are faced with having to say things that others don't understand or may get angry and upset about, such as that the offer of a room is limited, for example, for a month, people can find it so hard to say those things that they can become what we call a rescuer or a persecutor. A rescuer will want to make things all right as quickly as possible because they can't bear the distress of the other or the inequality. A persecutor will feel annoyed with the demanding, upset person, and they'll disbelieve them or they'll make them want to go away. Either of these positions is disempowering. So we talk about giving clarity warmly, and that enables people to keep their dignity. It's very easy to get burnt out in this field, and becoming a rescuer is one of the ways in which good people get burnt out. They just cannot see where they should draw the line and say, I can give this much, but I can't give this. It can feel selfish in the face of someone's appalling story to say, I can't give more than this. So I always say to people, we can all do something. There's always something everyone can do. You can't do everything. You can make a difference, but you can't change the world. And it's very important for all of us to hold on to that, because you get people who get this feeling that they can change the world, they can do everything, and they are the ones who will burn out. So the easiest thing to give is a smile, recognition of another's humanity, empathy. It gives dignity, helps others to feel intrinsically human and worthwhile. And this means simply not looking the other way. For example, at people sitting on the street begging. You don't have to give money if you don't want to, but just being able to smile helps a person to feel that they're not invisible. We can give our voices. We need to use our voices where others can't. We can write to or email our councillors or our MPs. We can express our disquiet when we read things in the papers that don't seem right. If people can speak out, for example, witnessing racism, however minor, or record it on their phone, or note everything if someone is being bullied or harassed, including the appearance of the perpetrator, and report it, that is a good thing, because racism is still illegal in this country, and it's very important that if we witness it, we don't keep silent. People who have it can give time, visiting a detention centre, raising money, setting up a group to raise funds, befriending a refugee, volunteering for a local charity, offering to teach English one-to-one to a vulnerable refugee or asylum seeker, etc. That's giving time. You can give money, again, those who have it, to feed or clothe or buy shoes or a meal for an asylum seeker in your nearest city, or to a charity. Refugee Resource is always looking for funding. We use our small limited hardship fund to ensure that no one should have nothing to eat and no one should be unable to get to the hospital. Some people nowadays find they can give space, e.g. a room or foster care to an asylum seeker, or a meal to someone who needs it in their home. This is the hardest thing to give. Once you invite someone into your home, you're vulnerable to their needs. You need to have strong personal boundaries and be able to state your preferences very clearly. And then you can offer support to others who are working with refugees and asylum seekers, especially those who have opened up a room in their home to somebody. Living cross-culturally with a person facing the added challenges of insecurity, fear, trauma and poverty is extremely challenging for hosts. So hosts may benefit from a listening ear, a non-judgmental friend, a break, a cup of coffee, a treat, and if misunderstandings arise, it can help to support a person to have compassion for themselves. Any country can become unsafe, no matter how structured, no matter how advanced. In Syria, all it took was people protesting against the government and an aggressive response from the powers that were, leading to an uprising determined to oust the regime. If we imagine thousands of British people pouring onto London's streets to protest against, for example, austerity and the injustice of much of the country's wealth in very few hands while homelessness visibly rises, and the government, unable to find a large enough number of police officers to contain the protests, reacted with fear and aggression, for example, tear gas or a water cannon, societal breakdown could begin to happen here too. It's always unlikely, but it's always possible. The bottom line is that people who flee here from other cultures and countries are people no different from ourselves, with the same needs, the same loves, the same internal lives as we have. I've spoken of cultural differences and said some shocking things, but a smile is the same in any language, as are tears, laughter, sharing of food, hospitality, willingness to learn, and recognition of another's humanity, oneself in another. Our society has been enormously enriched over the past decades by becoming more diverse. We've got films, music, books, foods, clothing, words in other languages, and so much more. In some of the poorest places in this country, we've seen some of the strongest solidarity. For example, when the dawn raids in Glasgow were met by residents standing side by side with asylum seekers about to be deported in 2007, which happened when initially hostile residents recognised that the asylum seekers placed in neighbouring properties had more in common than differences with them. When I heard about Fred Bloom, I thought that perhaps his vision for the future was being realised, not in the way he had imagined it, but just because we have become such a wonderfully diverse country. And what my hope is that, as the late Joe Cox stated, we will start to see, all of us, and I think I'm probably talking to people who already see this, but I mean as a country, we'll see that we have more in common than we have differences. But that sort of vision will only endure as long as there are people to support it. Thank you very much. So we now have a period for questions and discussion, and then we'll have refreshments. Yes? Well, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes people get under your skin. For example, I remember working with a young boy who looked very much like a member of my Indian family, and I couldn't switch off. I took him home with me at weekends. Sometimes your heart does break, but as I say at Refugee Resource to people whose hearts have been broken many times, hearts do break, but hearts also heal. Yes?
Could you say anything about the particular situation of children who are coming as refugees, and I guess particularly about that point at which they're going to, inverted commas, cease to be children or to be regarded as children?
Yes. Well, when children are obviously young, when they come as unaccompanied minors to this country, they become a ward of court immediately and they are given foster care. So the difficulty arises when they come towards the age of 18, which may not be when they're 18, it may be when they're 15 or 16 or 17, but because they're age assessed, they will sometimes be told that they're older than they are. Once they get towards the age of 18, they will often be told that now you're coming to the age of 18, we can deport you. So at that point, there's a break away from the rest of their peers, because our education system and everything is always geared towards a future. You have a future, you must work towards the future. All of a sudden, they don't have a future. And so that is the point when we often see them at Refugee Resource, unless they haven't been managing before that, and we've seen them in the context of their life with foster carers or social services. At that point, sometimes they need to be helped to say why it is that they fear being returned to their country for the first time. Because the strange situation with young people is that they don't get asked to make a statement in support of an asylum claim. But by the time they reach the age of nearly 18, they will be deemed to have reached the end of the line. So the difficult thing is getting them to say then, after what may be many years, what happened in their country that forced them to flee. So they are in a very, very vulnerable situation. And we have a group of mostly boys at Refugee Resource, young people, they're between the ages of sort of 13 and 23, and they are unaccompanied minors. They tend to band together. We've got all the boys in a football group at the moment. The main thing we try to do for them, apart from, make sure that they're studying or doing something and that they have an active claim, is to stop them becoming alienated and delinquent, to help them to still feel part of society and to remember themselves as good people who won't react to provocation with any kind of violence. Yes.
What changes have you seen through the various governments that you have experienced? I suppose the final years of the Blair government and the Brown government and the Cameron coalition and then the current government.
Until 2004, asylum seekers were allowed to work and study. And when that was changed, that led immediately to enormous hardship which has persisted. And over the years since then, we've seen things getting progressively harder, not only for asylum seekers and refugees actually, but also for the poorer British people. So we've seen more conflict between British deprived people and our clients. We've seen there wasn't a difference during the Blair government actually, although there wasn't a difference for asylum seekers. There was still the sense that they should, if they've reached the end of the line, leave the country. The Home Office has been a law unto itself for a good many years, since before I worked for Refugee Resource. We wanted to train them. I think one step that could be taken would be to teach the Home Office about the impact of trauma on a person's capacity to relate a coherent narrative. They haven't been interested. I think as things have got harder for British poor people, things have got also harder for people coming to this country who are poor in exactly the same ways. So, for example, we now have, you have to have a local connection if you have a right to housing in any area. If your connection to Oxford is that you were in Campsfield Detention Centre, that doesn't count as a local connection. So you can now get people who have no local connection anywhere and no right to live anywhere. Their quotas have been brought in, so this has been happening for a good many years, but there are now quotas for the number of people who can be accepted as refugees. And that means that if you get a caseworker in the Home Office who is giving too many people a favourable outcome, they won't be allowed to remain in that post because they are skewing the figures. And then more recently with this Conservative government, we've seen cuts to legal aid, and that's been a huge thing because that's the thing that means that you can't necessarily appeal because there's no legal aid to appeal unless you can prove to the legal aid that you've got more than 50% chance of success. So what we've seen is a progressive clamping down on human rights, and post-Brexit increased, not increased racism, but there's a feeling on the part of certain sections of society that it's more acceptable to be racist. So I'm sorry, it doesn't sound very good.
No, it's not.
No, it's not. No. Yes.
So Sheila, what you have talked about in the work of Refugee Resources is very inspiring and very, one can take a lot of comfort in a terrible situation that people are getting that kind of support. But I wonder if you have a sense of how many people there are, I don't know, in this area or overall, who would benefit, need the kind of support that you give, who can't be helped, aren't being helped, don't have any access to that kind of help.
Across the country, services vary. So, and even in Oxfordshire, I don't think people always know about us. We've had people who are referred who didn't know about us and have been here 16 years and needed a service really and didn't get one. So services are patchy across the country. There are some very good areas of work, and then there are some areas where the Poor Old Refugee Council is the only group which is anywhere near an area where a large number of asylum seekers are housed, and they're just overwhelmed. They cannot possibly meet people's needs. So it's patchy, and we're aware that we are a small charity. We do work in partnership with Asylum Welcome and the Red Cross and Open Door, and I think in Oxfordshire, if people are made aware of the services, they can get a reasonably good service from our charities, but I mean there are things we can't provide, like housing. But what we do is we send letters every year to all GPs in Oxfordshire, every GP by name, and solicitors and schools, trying to make them aware that these services exist and saying that we're free and you can refer people to us. So But when people get dispersed to other parts of the country, that's where the problem arises, because they say, well, who am I going to see instead of you? And sometimes we end up keeping in touch with people by phone or email because there isn't anything where they've gone. Yes.
I'm John Ido, and I'm one of the
Good job.
working for Refugee Resources. Thanks for your presentation. I really enjoyed and I got a lot of fun information. My question is that once asylum seeker got a negative decision and come back to Refugee Resources, and how seriously Home Office take the reports and statement from the Refugee Resources regarding to the asylum seeker? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. It very much depends on who the judge is. You will get some judges who, when they read a report about somebody, they will take it into account, and you get other judges who won't take it into account. They think we are gullible, fluffy, emotional, easy to convince. So it really depends whose desk it lands on. But we will try not to give up. So if we believe a person, and usually, I would say 98% of the time, a person is telling the absolute truth. Obviously, you will get people who will leave something out or who will change something. But if we know that someone is telling the truth, and a person can't fake trauma or grief, then we have solicitors who we work with who will take end-of-the-line cases, and so we try not to overuse these people, but the answer is, with the Home Office, it really depends who the judge is. Some of them are pretty draconian. Yes.
So is it for people who have still the right to appeal that you do that, or they've lost even the right to appeal, can they still use your service?
Yes, they can still use our service. Whether they can still make a claim for asylum is, sometimes people do get deported. We see people who are deported. It's pretty distressing, really. But if someone has reached the end of the line, and we can't just write letters and reports willy-nilly. You have to actually know the person, because you have to have a basis on which to write it. If somebody is coming to see us and they're at the end of the line, and they disclose something and say, well, I've never told anyone this before, and you say, well, wasn't it in your asylum claim? And they say it wasn't, then a fresh claim can be made on the basis of as evidence that wasn't available. But you have to say why it wasn't available. It can be very hard on the asylum seeker themselves, because they will get questioned about it in court, and they have to be able to bear the questioning. Sometimes we have to write a letter to say, this person went through this, and they are going to break down under questioning. So, sometimes a person just can't bear the questioning, and they can't say what happened to them in court. So sometimes what we write with that person is going to have to stand for their claim. And what usually happens with the Home Office is that they, in a case like that, they don't refuse or give asylum, they just let it drag on for years. So we've seen people who have been here, and this isn't the majority, but we've seen people who have been here 16, 17, 18 years, with no resolution to their asylum claim. Yes.
I imagine with the complexity of the work you do, that it's easy to be not bogged down but attending. And I wonder if you've ever written a paper on Britain being the most perfect place for asylum people. And if you did write that, what would be the first thing you'd really want to change? Us as British people, would you want us to change? What would really
You mean to make the country more perfect?
Yes, what would really thrill your heart?
It would thrill my heart if asylum seekers were allowed to work. And that would make all the difference, because what people find the most distressing thing when they've survived everything is to not be able to give not be able to become part of society, to be sort of kept out. That would make the biggest difference.
Why is that? Why is it that they can't work? Why is that changing?
Because at the time it was deemed politically expedient to say to British people, we're not going to let asylum seekers take your jobs. And that's the simple reason why. But the other thing that would make a difference actually would be to educate, and not only educate, to support the Home Office caseworkers, because I did go to see them. I went to see them with a group of refugees to ask them, do you think the culture in the Home Office could be changed? And what I found was not bad people, but burnt out, overworked people. So, compassion throughout the whole system would help. Yes.
Can you say something about how Refugee Resource is funded, and has that changed? Is it changing? What's the climate for support for the kind of stuff you do?
It's very up and down. We get a lot of referrals from the NHS, but we don't get funding that matches the referrals from the NHS. So we have to spend an awful lot of time bidding for bits of funding from lots of different trusts and foundations. And so the change I've seen since I started at Refugee Resources, we have now a plethora of different little funders, and they all want something back because a lot of them use us to tick their ethnic minority boxes. So a lot of time, and I think I try to protect the staff time actually and make sure it's client focused, but a lot of time is measuring outcomes, filling in funding reports, making sure the funders get what they want. So we basically have people working full time just trying to bring funds in. And it's never for very long, it's always a year, 2 years, maximum 3 years. So we're constantly trying to get funding, and in that we're no different from any other frontline charity, I think. But I think the thing that upsets me is that once upon a time, the work that we did might have been provided on the NHS and might have been provided to wider society, because I'm very aware that the trauma work that we do could be done with, for example, people who have fought in the war, British soldiers who have fought in Afghanistan, for example, could do with exactly the same kind of service that we provide for people fleeing from war. Does that answer your question?
Do you get no funding from the NHS?
Yeah, we do get funding from the NHS,
yeah.
yes, but they sort of send the same. I'm not complaining about the NHS. I know they are cash-strapped, and the compassion of people who work within the NHS is something we couldn't do without. But what they call them, the sort of chief executive and that level of people, they sort of they've sent the same few thousand every single year on year, and we have said to them, look at the number of referrals we're getting from the NHS and look at the support that we're giving to mental health services, but I think they're just in a bit of a mess, really, and very cash-strapped and overworked. So, I mean, we're working in a system which is creaking and tearing at the seams, really.
What's the bulk of the work that you do? Is it the trauma stuff and the counselling? Is that the main, in terms of the numbers of people?
Well, the majority of our clients will end up having more than one service from Refugee Resource. So the counselling service is the biggest service within Refugee Resource in that there are 7 of us. But the women's group is huge. It's because practically every woman that comes to Refugee Resource, as soon as they're well enough, we'll try to get them in the women's group. The mentoring service, when people leave counselling, we will maybe try to match them with a mentor. So we have about 300 clients a year at Refugee Resource, and out of those, maybe 70 will see a counsellor for some period of time.
Good. You described an administrative, legal and political complex. You call it a system, is that. So
a misnomer. Clearly, it is imperfect from your point of view, and probably the point of view of everybody in this room, in a whole variety of ways. Some really quite specific, and it's hard to see why the situation has arisen, like this point about whether asylum seekers can work or not. Other things much more sort of culturally embedded and probably difficult to address on short time scales, really. I suppose the question really is, where has it done better? I mean, how does this compare with France or the Netherlands or Italy or and Germany, of course? And what specific ways can we learn from better practice elsewhere?
That's an interesting question about where we've done better. I'm not sure we do better than Italy, and definitely.
No, I'm not asking where we've done better,
but where we do
where
well.
Where we do better. That's right. Where we could look for better practice or better solutions.
Well, Canada is still a welcoming country to refugees, and indeed Scotland is more welcoming to refugees than England. So. We don't need to look very far to see countries who do better. But the things which are good about this country, and which I haven't said, is it's a great relief to people to come to a place where there is law and order. And one of the things we do is we have a friendly police officer who comes in, and we will tend to introduce a friendly police officer to people and say, in this country, if you are being abused or exploited, you can go to the police. And I think that holds across the whole EU. So it's not about this being a terrible country. It's about it, I think, at the moment, the economic model in this country is the thing which takes the highest precedence, economics. And I think where we could do better is to see the intrinsic worth and value of every human being, and see that sort of the economic system is here to serve humanity, not all of us here to serve the economic system. But I think this is said in a number of quarters. There are a lot of good people in this country. I would say actually the majority of people wouldn't walk past you if you were lying in the street. So it's not about massively changing this country, it's about building on what's good instead of constantly thinking in terms of what a person is costing, I think. I'm not sure if that's answered your question. But it's just it's a difference in emphasis that's needed really across the board, I think. And one thing I didn't say is that one thing we need to do at Refugee Resource is to help people to live in the country as it is, not as they wish it would be. So we have to actually help people to deal with racism, to live with it, to make a life in spite of it, or to deal with injustice, or to deal with NHS waiting lists. We can't make this a perfect country for anyone. And people sometimes have this fantasy that because they've fled such terrible things, that once they've got here, that nothing bad is going to happen ever again. And that actually causes them a great deal of pain, because of course bad things happen all the time. So one thing is to help people to see that life is not going to be any better here than ordinary, but ordinary life is such a gift, really. Yes?
Isn't it against the Geneva Convention or something to stop people working? To say that people can't work? Isn't it globally illegal?
That's a good thing. It's an interesting thing you say there, because according to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, we have all sorts of rights, like the right to a family life, which is what is often cited when a young person who's been here since they were young is about to be deported aged 18. And yes, the right to marry and live with one's spouse and the right to work are enshrined in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And we are signatories to that, but it is not the law. So you're right, and I think the vision was that it would be law, but it never has become law.
That must suit the legislation that they brought in preventing refugees to work.
Well, asylum seekers, refugees can work. It's people who are seeking asylum who can't work. Once somebody becomes a refugee, they have the same rights as everyone else, as every British citizen, except for 5 years. Yes.
If people have been here for like 18 years without a successful asylum claim, how have they been living if they can't work and they can't claim benefits and they don't have any right to basically anything?
A very common scenario for us is to meet someone who has been subsisting in some way in return for something from somebody, and this is where I refer to exploitation. So, for example, we had a man come to see us and his feet and hands were eaten away by frostbite, and he was from Iran. He had come 18 years ago and he had been sleeping in a corridor in return for doing menial jobs for somebody who would then give him food at the end of the day. So people can live like wild animals, really. I mean, this is why I say the resilience of a human being is incredible and can't be underestimated, because although he had become like a wild animal, he was capable of reaching out when he discovered we existed and making relationships and learning to take care of himself and accepting more help than he was getting. But people tend to live by someone will take them in and in return for something will give them a bare living. And we see a lot of that. And some people who take people in are good. Many people who take people in are good, actually. But you will get people who will take in a vulnerable person and use them to do all their domestic work, for example, in return for a blanket in the corner of the kitchen. And that's how a lot of people live. And it's so hidden. Yes.
But the person who's doing this, are they in their right? Is it legal to just have someone in your house without, this other person not being legal in the country? How does it work?
Well, it's legal so long as you're not asking for rent. You can't rent a room to an asylum seeker, but you can give them somewhere to stay. So no, they're not doing anything illegal. On the other hand, if someone has been trafficked into this situation, then the person is doing something illegal. So the law is a very complex thing, and I don't even begin to pretend to understand it. But I've seen things argued in court that have made me think that if someone knows the law inside out, they can successfully argue that black is white. Yes.
Can you say something about the role of the mosque?
The mosque?
In this kind of situation?
Yeah, the mosque. Well, I don't know about all mosques, and there are several mosques in Oxford, but certainly there are mosques in Oxford that will open their doors to homeless asylum seekers. For example, in the winter, we often have young people sleeping in the mosque. The mosque is a great bringer together of followers of Islam, and the mosque is a place where, as far as I can see, it's more for men than for women. I think women are different and separate in the mosque, but men call each other brothers and flock to the mosque on a Friday. If you walk up Cowley Road, all the men are out going to the mosque, and there is tremendous solidarity there. I think we rely on the mosques as much as we rely on the NHS in terms of people taking care of people and offering shelter. And churches, I should add that churches also do great work with asylum seekers and refugees in terms of the congregation helping people who are members of the congregation, and sometimes people find a home through the church. So it's very interesting that those people with a religious faith will very often do better than those without a religious faith, and that's partly because of the support of the religious group that they belong to, but also partly because if a person has a religious faith of some kind, they can see what happened to them in the light of like making a story about it. So, for example, someone of a Muslim faith, in the Quran, there is Ayub, who is like Job in the Old Testament or the Torah, who suffered, and he suffered because God was testing him. And there are some people who believe that, and they actually do better because they believe that there's a reason for their suffering. Those people who can't make a story out of their lives are the ones who find it the hardest. Some people make us, sorry, I'm just going to add something, because we get people who make a story out of their lives not by looking back but by looking forward, and they will say, I've suffered so much that I want to do some work to make sure other people don't suffer. So we have a large number of our clients who go on to work in the NHS as nurses, care assistants, occupational therapists, even doctors and psychiatrists. And they weren't doing that in their country, but they do it because it makes meaning of their suffering. I'll say one more thing, and then I think we could break up and go and have refreshments. I think I've probably made it sound extremely dark and depressing, and there is that side of it. There's no doubt about it. A lot of what we see is extremely dark and depressing. But if you came to Refugee Resource, you wouldn't know it, because everyone is happy to be alive, happy for the time being to be in a country where their lives are not at risk. And there is a tremendous sense of solidarity and togetherness, and we have an awful lot of fun and laughter. And sometimes just having a cup of coffee with someone is what makes them smile. So I don't want people to think that this is just about going out amongst the extremely poor and miserable, because we do meet kindred spirits from all over the world, and there is a lot of celebration at Refugee Resource.
Thank you very much, Sushila, and thanks again, everyone, for coming. If you'd like to carry on the discussion with some refreshments, they're in the dining room, and you're all welcome to join.